really want to start by thanking everybody, Carolyn, Kelly, and everyone else, and the students, amazing students who've been working with us and teaching us, and the folks who have gone to classes to sit in with Jan and Rose this morning. Thank you so much. It's been just an amazing week. We've learned so much about our own work through you and about your work through you, and are going to go back to New York recharged to do this work in some new ways because of who we've met here. So thank you very, very much. Great. Yep. Okay. So the last few days we've been talking to classes, meeting with classes. We've been meeting with students very informally on the mailboat, on the tour we took of Casco Bay with them. And in those informal talks, we've referred to a number of the projects that we've done over the past 6 years together, including current ones. And today we thought we would focus primarily on our process, our methodology, and how that informs the actual images that we end up with, the projects we end up with. So we're going to go back and forth between stories of the projects themselves and the process. And we hope this can be informal as well, and would really welcome questions in the middle of what we're saying. You don't necessarily have to wait till we're done.
We'll definitely have lots of time at the end.
Yeah, it's going to be relatively brief.
And we're going to kind of go through the work that's over at the gallery, at the area gallery, a little more in depth. So that'll be kind of a setup for that. So any questions you have about that while we're here is kind of directly related to that work. So this is an image from the feasibility project, which is a project we did in 2008, and we've kind of newly revisited it recently. And what it is an installation of 50 posters, which we're actually inviting all of you and your friends, anyone at USM, to actually take one down, tear one off, and reinstall it elsewhere. So you'll see that in context over at the area gallery. But just so you, when looking at this is just one piece of 50 that's installed over at the gallery right now.
And the theme that we were talking about, kind of boiling down what we think our process and project as Smudge is about into one or two words, and we think it boils down to the word change. Change, it's speeds of change, scales of change, lived realities of change, the material conditions of change unfolding right under our feet in the 21st century, massive scales of change. Those themes have informed a lot of our work, and the feasibility project with the 50 tear sheets that you'll find in the gallery is something that focuses on what it's like to live at the edges of change, and in particular at the edges of feasibility as things are changing.
So we also see our work is kind of changing those edges. So you'll see there's these different takes on what the edges of feasibility are. And it's probably worth noting that our process has so much to do with creating graphic designs. So you'll see graphic design as a through line throughout a lot of our work. And these ideas of taking these really kind of complex ideas and boiling them down to simple statements like this. So this was one of our primary motivations, which you can see this in context. So taking, provocative things like making at the edges of feasibility or living together, these really elaborate things that would mean something different to each viewer, that you could reinterpret that, reinstall it somewhere else, that kind of boiled down statement, kind of like the spare simplicity of something that suggests so much more, is kind of at the heart of the feasibility project.
And our projects have, we've located our projects at edges of change, the kinds of change that are unprecedented and that people don't seem to have language for yet, don't quite grasp yet, the kinds of changes that we don't fully understand, we don't necessarily have designs or practices for responding to them yet. And the Edges of Feasibility project kind of locates us at that kind of change. We like to think of our practice as taking ourselves to those edges, moving along with them somehow, inhabiting edges of change for a period of time, and making work directly at those edges, with those edges, collaborating with edges of change, making something of that, and thereby changing those edges somehow, but also changing ourselves in relation to them. And we think of them and make something of them in terms of that kind of lived experience of being at them as edges of change. So what we will be able to show you here is how that played out, how that kind of aspiration to go to edges and inhabit them and move with them and make something at them, how that plays out across several of our projects.
This is a card that we created for a research trip in 2009. A lot of our work, again, it's graphic design, kind of pass-outs, handoffs that we shared these with people that we met along the way, but we thought this was a great kind of summary of our motivation for that project. This intersection of the human and geologic, bringing these like spans of time and change in relation to a human lifetime. This idea that there's more to come, there's like continuous change. It's kind of been a major theme.
Jamie, can you speak up just a little bit?
Sure.
Okay. So if we were to borrow some words from an amazing cultural theorist, her name is Elizabeth Ellsworth, and think through our project in terms of those words, here's what we'd offer. That as artists and designers over the past 7 years, we've developed a research methodology that attempts to make the sometimes unrecognized agents of change, the sometimes unrecognized events of change, to make them appear to us concretely. We've created for ourselves a series of data gathering test sites, you could call them test sites, where at sites and moments where paths of our own perception and our own habitual ways of thinking cross the paths of various agents of change and various events of change. So at these crossroads of kind of old historical ways of thinking or habitual ingrained ways of thinking or old assumptions that we kind of play by as human beings on the planet, cross right now in the midst of unfolding events of change and agents of change. And again, in the projects we're going to show you, you can see how we've located ourselves at sites where those two things cross. Our intention then is to creatively respond to and at those crossing points. And our responses tend to be, we've talked about our responses for a number of years as signals. We try to signal these crossing points. We try to make something shareable out of these crossing points, something that summons up, as this quote says, summons up sensations to come, summons up a people to come, summons up worlds or universes to come.
So this is from the project Below the Line, which we did in 2010, and this is in response to an ancient Pleistocene lake that once covered most of the state of Utah, about 20,000 years ago. And if you've traveled in Utah in the present day, you'll realize very quickly that it's a very arid, dry desert. So to us, this signaled a completely different landscape, one of these incredible spaces of transformation. The map on the left is from a U.S. Geological Survey from the 1800s, a trip where artists and scientists traveled together. This was pre-photography, so artists were sent on the trip to document the routes of travel. So we poetically and literally took up their routes of travel. Our Google Map translation is on the right. These are the sites that we went to, documenting where the lake shore meets the edges today. So we did the perimeter to see what we would encounter in terms of where the human and the geologic converge today. We could see these remnants of the lake. So again, projecting our imagination into the past, the present, and the future, imaginatively inhabiting two spaces simultaneously was a big part of the Below the Line project.
So if we kind of cycle back through those concepts of change and then these crossroads of old ways of thinking about things or receive the given ground of how we think about things meets the ungiven ground, the ground that's continuously unfolding and changing at various speeds. With this particular project, the crosshairs of those two tends to be a place of geologic change, where change is unfolding extremely, extremely slowly, imperceptibly, and yet powerfully, enough to reshape entire areas the size of entire states in the United States. Give it enough time, and it will move hundreds of miles from one end of a state to another. Give it enough time, and it will go from the largest freshwater lake imaginable in Utah to the small salt lake. So that is one vector of change that we located ourselves at, that very slow-moving geologic plodding along change that's relentless and massively powerful, meeting contemporary forces of change that are unleashed by human beings in our activity. So, for example, the new subdivision that's above Salt Lake City that grows up within months or years meets this streamy landscape that is continuing to unfold under the feet of these houses at a much longer rate of change.
So the houses are actually perched on the previous shoreline of the lake, so it's sort of hidden in plain sight. This is the kind of geologic evidence that the lake was there. So it's an amazing juxtaposition when you see these things. I mean, the whole time we're driving for several weeks, there's this line almost on the horizon everywhere we went, carved into the mountains, where the lake just continued to lap. And interesting to begin to imagine how everywhere we were driving would have been completely underwater. And then geologically, how that time frame is very small, given how quickly the lake is gone. So the Great Salt Lake is a present-day remnant of this lake, so it does still exist in some form. So during this research trip, we had a residency at the Center for Land Use Interpretation in Wendover, Utah, and this is kind of the space of the residency on the historic Wendover Airfield base. So we were able to do photography and Super 8 documentation of the landscape. So this view is kind of like below the line. This is on the ground. This is on the floor of the lake. We used maps from the U.S. Geological Survey to follow the perimeter of the lake. So this is the edge, the blue is the map of where the lake lapped. But this area now is the Bonneville Salt Flats where they do speed racing. So you've seen images of that really white, thick inches of salt. That's the bed of Lake Bonneville. And today it's dry desert. So this is still from a Super 8 film.
And as we were inhabiting this space, which is the Center for Land Use Interpretation's repurposed Quonset hut, redesigned Quonset hut by Simhark, a group that actually was here on campus, was Carolyn, a couple of years ago, actually created a structure inside the art gallery here on this campus. Simhark took over the Quonset hut with Chloe and retrofitted it for artists to live in. So this is an artist residency out in the middle of the desert outside of Wendover that resides side by side with still in use the structures that are part of the historic air base. And as we were there, what started to happen was we were on the floor of the ancient Lake Bonneville looking up to these mountains surrounding us and seeing that line of the lake all around us. And our project started to morph at that point. That's when our practice started to hit that crossroads where the forces of change and contemporary life start inflecting our experience in a new direction, and we start going in a completely unexpected direction for the project. And that was when we started to realize that in terms of human time scales and human lifetimes, we are living contemporaneously with the ancient Lake Bonneville. The space of time between when the lake was lapping up along these lines and creating these lines that you can still visually see all around the Great Basin, and the moment where we are right now is instantaneous in terms of great spans of geologic time. It's almost like it was yesterday. And we can still see the evidence of that almost like it was yesterday everywhere. And that's when the project changed and became, instead of following that line of the historic mappers around the Great Basin, it became, how can we as contemporary artists start to signal the fact that we live on this planet in deep relationship with this deep hum of the geologic force unfolding, and we are doing this kind of contemporary riff and much faster on top of it, but we are living in deep collaboration with it. And all the talk of streamy landscape that we did in preparation for the trip on Casco Bay really kind of came true the other day with the earthquake we had here. It's like, yeah, the same day we were talking to students about the streamy landscape and how we were going to address landscape as an event and make art in relation to landscape as an event, actually became an event right under our feet the day that we took the trip.
So when we're out doing this image gathering, research gathering, we take all kinds of media with us. So you can see here there's We've been doing tracing on the playa floor. We have Super 8 cameras, digital cameras. We really bring a variety of tools. So much of it is about responding to what we find in the moment when we're in the landscape. So we're really open to the type of media that we travel with. This is the salt flats, so this is also the lake bed outside of Wendover. So again, there's the line carved into the side of the hill. It's just amazing when you start to see these literal through lines through the landscape. These huge forces. I mean, in terms of putting these scales of human perspective, into context so quickly, it's quite remarkable. I mean, the whole American West is filled with these remnant lakes of these massive bodies of water that used to be there. So again, the lake line is off in the distance. This is also in Wendover. This is a 30-minute clip of a Super 8 film that was shot during the Wendover residency in response to the changing landscape, and kind of the social political juxtaposition that exists within this very small town. The space of the residency is bordering Utah and Nevada, so you find this juxtaposition between two very different states' historical, economic situation while having this residency.
So we got invited to offer the results of this trip to a project that was being curated by some colleagues of ours. And we were trying to figure out, okay, how can we take this big complex series of ideas about geologic time, geologic futures, rates of change, speed of change, scales of change, human meets the geologic, human activity meets the landscape. How can we take this big cluster of ideas and boil it down into something that offers an aesthetic experience of complex information and also makes it accessible rather quickly? And so the idea that we came up with was to design a visual experience of parts of the trip that talked about above the line and below the line, and arrange the results of the pauses we took throughout this landscape to be with it and think with it, to range it in terms of above the line and below the line.
So you'll see in the installation at the area gallery, it's a series of photos, of 16 photos, imaged from above and below, accompanied with short captions that kind of give you a sense of how we're reading what's above and below the line, along with the map and the routes of travel that we have.
So in some ways, the whole project of landscape interpretation that, and land use interpretation that the Center for Land Use Interpretation allowed us to have as their residency, it's a process of reading the landscape as a text and taking from it ideas and realities that allow us to see the landscape from new directions, not in terms of the kind of sentimentalized, romantic notions of the Old West or the American West, but in terms of the contemporary realities of land use there and landscape there.
So it's really about documenting the change while it's in the midst. So this is more of a snapshot of where we are now in the midst of historic past and futures to come. So Geologic City is the next project, and we finished this in 2011, and it takes the form of a field guide that we have a copy of here. And it's also broken apart and installed on the wall at the area gallery. And it visits 20 sites across New York City, and we have a short summary of how we describe it.
So we introduced this project as by declaring that New York City is a geologic hotspot. And we gave ourselves a lot of poetic license in appropriating geology in relation to this project, but we tried to take that poetic license within a context of doing a lot of research about the notions from geology that we borrowed. So we say here that here humans channel and reshuffle earth materials on a scale and with consequences that rival major geologic events. So like an island-building volcano, or like a river diverting fault shift, the city instantly transforms materials that took slow and powerful earth forces that took vast spans of time to create. In the process, the city unleashes utterly new geodynamics that will play out for thousands and in some cases millions of years to come. So with this project, Geologic City, a field guide to the geoarchitecture of New York, we try to take the users of this little book to 20 sites where they can sense the geologic pulse of New York City. We ask them to let their imaginations take it from there into the flux of geologic actors from our own and from other worlds, because some of the materials we trace back to pre-Earth origins.
Just at the field guide, there's a commonality with the feasibility project in that it's intended to have people kind of reinterpret and use this in their own ways. So the field guide is designed more to get people out to start experiencing some of the sites, but it also start to reimagining their habitualized movements through the city or familiar iconic sites. Like we include Rockefeller Center in the field guide to experience things in a new way and sort of to activate their own pathway. So it's really about getting people kind of out into the landscape or into the environment and thinking differently about what they encounter. And that happened for us, of course, in the process of doing this. This took a year of research. This is just one of 17 sites in New York City that's the road salt that's spread on New York City during snowstorms. And in one single snowstorm, the salt will be spread across the city, melted and disappears down city drains, and it's 8 million years old. And it comes from the driest desert on Earth, the Atacama Desert. And so it's this juxtaposition of the time scales at which we can use these materials, transform them, melt them away, and that the materiality isn't literally gone. It's salinating the Hudson River and the Bay. It's taking on a new form. But our pace and ability to transform such huge masses of material and the geologic history is embedded in this. Each of these sites kind of pinpoints that, tells a short story, and invites people to interpret it as they will.
And some of the kind of playful appropriations of geologic ideas that we allow ourselves to do. Ephemeral, yeah. So for example, ephemeral is probably familiar to many of you as the word used to describe vents of steam that are around volcanoes or geysers. They're called ephemerals. And New York has lots of ephemerals if you see them through the eyes of smudge walking down the streets at night. It's a geologic force in the sense that these steam vents are created by steam tunnels that run all throughout New York that heat the city and air condition the city and come from power plants up the river and that are using geologic materials from around the area and from far away and create this geologic force of ephemeral in the middle of the street in New York City. So while that's absolutely not what a geologist would recognize as ephemeral, when we've shown it to geologists, they crack up and kind of laugh and say, yeah, that's like a playful way of using that term. I could see how you'd see it. You would say that. So it's been really interesting talking to geologists about appropriations like that.
Excuse me. Could you explain again why it's being released in the city? Those
vents?
fumerals? Yeah.
It's basically it's broken somewhere.
Okay.
So somewhere it's leaking.
All right.
Underground, and then they create the vent so that the pressure doesn't build up underground.
Okay.
And sometimes they get fixed and the fumerals go away, but others have been there for like a really long time because maybe it's a geologic hotspot. It's a pressure point that they can't quite unbreak without going all the way up the line. So it's just a vent.
Release.
And it's,
There's been a couple
They come and
really,
go.
dangerous steam explosions. I mean, the pressure inside of the pipes are amazing.
Yeah.
And it's only in Manhattan, and it's actually one of the greenest forms of energy that the city has. It's for air conditioning and heating, museum, climate control. So it's really quite amazing.
It's made from the waste heat that would otherwise be dispersed as waste heat from burning fossil fuels. So instead of wasting all that and burning more fossil fuels to create the heat that the steam generates, they recycle that steam into the steam pipes under New York City, and that saves them from having to make even more heat that would go into the steam pipes.
How long have they been doing that?
A long time.
Early 1900s?
Yeah, I think it's close to 100 years, I think.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So again, part of our process is to take these research-intensive projects and translate them into aesthetic forms that can be easily disseminated in multiples and distributed. So the field guide is yes, a year of research, come down to 20 sites, with elaboration on our blog, which has extensive documenting of our travels to these sites and more pages of research and things. But we've really boiled it down for the field guide.
So we're really trying to bring aesthetic work and aesthetic experience into the mix and create hybrid works that bring media, aesthetic experience, research, and field experiences, like embodied field experiences, actually making these things appear to us concretely and then responding to them as artists. We try to make that happen with these projects. So with this project, Jamie pretty much designed an itinerary throughout New York City that we were going to take up for, what, 9 months?
Yeah, it took that long. Yeah.
So like every couple weeks when we had some time in our schedule, there was like something on the calendar. It's like, okay, today we're getting on the subway and going to this part of New York that we've never been to before. We're going to look for fumaroles, or we're going to look for a desert moraine, or we're going to see where the salt is stored.
So immense collaboration with the city. I mean, it takes a while to set up the appointment to meet the Department of Sanitation to document the salt, or the historian at Central Park to find out where in the park these steps are, which Robert Smithson documented in 1972. So all we had proof of was in his collection of writings, this photograph, and we thought it was a beautiful, act of geopoetry, but had no idea where in the park Robert Smithson, took this photo. So it was fun being a detective, being in the city, in a different way. But it took like 3 or 4 visits to Central Park to be able to actually talk to the historian. There was a random police officer who said, "I think it's over there."
Wandering around, showing the police officer this Xerox photograph from the Robert Smithson. Have you seen these steps? And, so, well, I think maybe they're over there. So it was I think part of what we're trying to capture with these projects is what it feels like on the human scale as human beings to go out into the world looking for these huge forces at play that are shaping our daily lives in a place like New York City, and meet them one-to-one in the little way that we can in these little human being bodies compared to these big forces, and respond to them creatively in a way that allows us to see them for what they are here and now today, rather than, for example, like every tourist that comes to New York goes to Rockefeller Center pretty much, and has the same old story of Rockefeller Center, what it is, where it came from. But we wanted to see it differently, and standing and looking at it and taking a picture of it like that, it started to feel like core samples that geologists take, where they drill down and pull out a long core of earth and elevate it so that you can see all the layers. So we started to imagine Rockefeller Center as a core sample of the
in many ways it is
limestone.
It's Indiana limestone. All of this stone came straight out of the earth in Indiana, so this amazing transposition of materiality into the sky in Rockefeller Center.
Any questions about this project or responses to it?
I was thinking about the landfill in New York City.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like, did you guys consider that a geologic force?
Yes, it's in
It's
our
in
book.
here.
Yep.
They give these tours. You can get on a little bus and go to Fresh Kills and stand on this 200-foot pile of garbage. It's amazing. And they're turning it into a park. I mean, it's becoming a landscaped, entirely new environment. And simultaneously, it's outgassing methane, which is heating like 30,000 homes on Staten Island. So these really interesting juxtapositions of how the garbage is taking on this new form, and they're trying to make it into a park. But again, yeah, we had never been to Fresh Kills. I mean, it's a storied place. So.
It's not a place we went. But once we got out there, we were trying to figure out what to pair it with in terms of a poetic use of geologic terminology. And there's this geologic term, it's called a pluton. And a pluton is a large body of volcanic rock that's formed when a plume of magma from under the earth cools and then solidifies underground. So it's like a big bubble of solidified magma. And it's named after the classical god of the underworld, Pluto. So we named the Fresh Kills site Pluton, saying that just as other mountains are known today for their concentrations of coal, uranium, or granite, Fresh Kills Park might be known 2,000 years from now for its plutons of plastic.
Liz and Jamie, can you talk a little bit about how you're received as artists, researchers at the various sites?
Sure, it's been very positive. People have been very open and supportive. I think the Fresh Kills landfill blog park, covered that we were doing research there. The Central Park historian was thrilled that someone was intrigued and wanted to know about the stairs because she knew about 20 other sets of staircases. She thought we might be interested in photographing also, but we want the ones Robert Smithson photographed. The Department of Sanitation, again, was very friendly and kind, despite it being not the usual request, but I guess some dancers had used the space by the salt a couple weeks before to do a performance there. So, you know, the city is pretty accommodating. I think requests aren't so strange. It does help to have, you know, support from grants or foundations to be able to say that the research is going to be made into something in a printed form, so that definitely helped too.
There's one site that we photographed that we were supposed to, but we did anyway, because it's on a public street. And it's the site that's near the largest oil spill in the history of the United States, which is not the Gulf of Mexico. It's right in the city of New York. And it's now forming a huge underground lake of oil that the houses in Greenpoint float upon, basically. So we called this area of Greenpoint a prehistoric life spill, linking the oil to the prehistoric life that oil comes from. And took this photograph, which was forbidden by the sign on the gate. Basically, you can't take photographs of this, which was so ludicrous because it's a public street. So we took the photograph anyway. So that was, we did not ask permission and wouldn't for something like that, because actually it's within our legal rights as long as we're on a public street to shoot anything. So that was, but that was a little scary at one point. I mean, we shot that from the car window. We didn't want to be standing there.
Drive-by photography.
Yeah, that was a drive-by version. If you're kidding about
Drive-by
it.
shooting, that's called.
Well, I'm just wondering if this isn't particularly appealing because it falls into the aesthetic of not making more things for the world, but rather identifying. And I wrote Smithson's name down right away, and Heiser, who really make artifacts, and you really are saying no. And I have mixed feelings about that because it's very seductive. We're showing you these great events. They exist. They're also, in some ways, saying humans aren't involved. And there's some sort of talk about you're humanizing it, but you're also taking away the human element. And that's also a mixed bag for me. But
taking away the human element? How?
Well, I think of Smithson's act as very much of self-identity, even though it's in nature. And yet these things are larger than that, and they exist pre-cultural, which is very powerful, and I love that. But I have such great mixed feelings about it. But the appealing thing is that you're not creating more things for the world. They already kind of exist, in large part. I mean, there seem to be exceptions. Does you think that's part of the appeal that opens what Kelly was asking, how are you received? Do you think that there's sort of an underlying denominator there? That you're showing us things that are incredibly powerful, but are not adding to stuff in the world?
Yeah, I'm not sure that is our motivation.
Right.
There isn't an artistic requirement that we don't create things, but I think there is an interest in recontextualizing habitual ways of seeing, or not viewing, fresh kills as a potential aesthetic response. And I think we get a big inspiration from the Center for Land Use Interpretation for that. If you're familiar with their work. They take groups of people on bus tours of the landfill in Los Angeles. There's something about just breaking out of the normal ways of seeing. Matt Coolidge, the director, has a great phrase about the highways of convention, of ways of seeing, and having your toolbox ready for these other modes of interpretation. So if you don't have a context to re-experience what you see every day in a new way, then what do you take for granted? What do you miss? How do we design new responses to these really kind of big challenges in terms of consumption and resources and materials? But we've enjoyed making small things that move through the world and people can activate themselves. But I wouldn't say it's like anti-object.
No.
Yeah, it didn't feel like it just seems so available to us in a different way than having to build something.
Well, I think this maybe addresses what you're saying from a slightly different angle. And as we say on one of the introductory pages here, there is no zero in Geologic City, as in zero waste or zero impact or zero footprint. Like, there's a lot of rhetoric and sustainability about getting to the zero of our impact. And what we say here is there is no zero. There is no outside of the materials and the flows that compose our cities. Humans live within and contribute to this mix very directly. These continuous exchanges between the material of the city and the humans never add up to zero, as in zero waste or zero carbon footprint. Each interaction between a human and a geologic actor in the city adds new directions and new potentialities, both to the humans and to the geo. And when we humans aim for the sum of zero between our acts of consumption and conservation, we miss the opportunity to acknowledge and respond to the complex geologic flows that propagate far beyond zero when we design, build, inhabit, and move through the city. So we're trying to also address people who might use this in a way that helps them see that they are a geologic, that the city is a geologic force because we're there as humans generating these things and materials that will go on way beyond the human species is going to be on this planet. Our stuff is going to be here. So we're trying to address that. I think that's addressing what you were saying from maybe a slightly different angle.
Yeah, and that juxtaposition of, you know, the material, it's like brush kills is the inverse of the pile of salt. It's like sometimes it's about materials becoming invisible, in other cases about human action creating and piling up of materials, and that there's this massive rearrangement of just scales of change that humans are facilitating. Just, yeah, thinking about that in different ways.
And it's those different, thinking about it in different ways that we think is at the key to our process. Because if we can read all the books or all the websites, you know, in the studio in preparation for going out to do these things, but always, always, always something happens when we're out there taking photographs or talking to people or just sitting and being in a space. Always something happens that gives it that little twist. And that little twist isn't just for the sake of something new or different. It really is for the sake of the contemporary moment. Because what is unfolding right now in the here and now is always twisting what we have thought about it from the past. So it's trying to get a sense of how what's happening right in front of our eyes is different from everything we've read. And then trying to give expression to that in a way that has an aesthetic charge.
So we have one more project to share with you, which is called Repository, and this is an image of Yucca Mountain in Nevada, and this mountain is actually being hollowed out inside. It was getting prepared to open, becoming prepared for the storage of high-level nuclear waste. As of the Obama administration, this project has been canceled. The site's been deemed unsuitable geologically because it's volcanic tuff, it's very porous, water can leak through it. It's actually a very geologically, seismically active site, so earthquakes in the future are concerned. But the design parameters for this mountain was that it needed to safely secure nuclear waste for 1 million years by the EPA, it's the Environmental Protection Agency. So this kind of design challenge is unprecedented in human history. And so we were intrigued by this design challenge in terms of humans having to come up for the first time with something that could design to last this. So our curiosity is piqued by the idea of this design feat. And during our below the line trip, we were driving out of Idaho and passed this truck, which is transporting transuranic nuclear waste. And this was our first encounter with a truck on a civilian highway, seemingly just a mundane everyday activity, but like, this is nuclear waste traveling on the highway. What kind of canisters are these things designed for? This waste is dangerous, you know, for the next 10,000 years. It's going to a repository in southern New Mexico. And being really interested in the design of these canisters and this truck in the highway, reinterpreting the everyday highway as a transportation space for this kind of materiality. So this sort of unexpected encounter launched the repository project that we've been working on for over a year now. So these are the routes of travel that nuclear waste travels throughout the United States. So it's major interstates and highways. This happens every day.
I'm glad we're not on that route there.
Well, actually, we came here pretty much straight from a 10-day field trip to do this project that we had funding from the Graham Foundation for. And what I'd like to read to you is just a very brief paragraph that describes, cycles back again through our methodology or our practice and how we approach this project. And it's this, that with this project we designed an itinerary of travel that had the potential to create a particular form of field experience on the road. Namely, moments when direct encounters with material realities of nuclear waste and its movements could play out across and reconfigure our own preconceptions and habitual ways of thinking of this stuff. We paused then at these crossroads again of our habitual ways of thinking and the lived realities of the material world as they unfold right now. We paused at these crossroads and collected visual data that we will now begin to use to generate some aesthetic responses. And that's where we are in the practice right now. So the route we designed for this was pretty much opportunistic. It's the time we had, the money we had, and we started in Salt Lake City, over here.
Yep, right above that.
And we started there and went to see a site of nuclear waste disposal, and then traveled roads through uranium tailing sites that are being disposed in various ways. Swung over to Los Alamos National Lab, came down to the highway where all the waste from the United States, all these places, including us, over here, way over in New England, our waste is like right now moving this way, and kind of converges right here. And the last space that it travels is this amazing road from up here to the waste isolation treatment plant where it's going to be sequestered. And this is where the swerve of this whole practice for this 10 days ended up happening for us. The place where we encountered a whole constellation of events that changed the project for us and now gave us something we think is pretty exciting to do for the next 8 months on this project. So we'll tell you a little bit about that.
So part of the motivation for doing this trip was we don't have any of the footage with us. We have about 20 hours of high definition video, but to mount the camera on top of the car, seemingly thinking it was from the perspective of waste traveling on the routes, rather than it being us traveling, as this is the route that the waste sees and travels throughout the United States. So we've really tried to offer up a new perspective in terms of positioning ourselves outside of the politics. It's just the routes of travel in itself that we were specifically looking at. So this is a site, I think this is Farnwell. This is a low-level waste site. It's amazing how many places there are throughout the United States where waste is being temporarily stored until Yucca Mountain opens or elsewhere. These are dry casks, so when nuclear power plants close and they're no longer open, or as fuel rods are spent, these casks are designed to hold the waste for between 100 to 300 years. So the project's full name is Repository, a Typological Guide to America's Ephemeral Nuclear Infrastructure, because essentially anything we design is ephemeral in relation to the lifespan of the materiality. So to date, these are kind of our best design attempts for containing these materials. It's another dry cask. So in June, we finished a pack of cards. It was sort of the first iteration of Repository, and it's a 42-card deck that we can show you some examples of. So this is one version. This is pre the video project. So the way the research transformed, we had been researching this for a year. It was about boiling down, hundreds of websites into these easy to experience. We should wait for that. Cards that takes these really complex, overwhelming subject matter into single images and short captions, and you'll see all 42 of them displayed on the wall at the area gallery.
Are there any security issues in your getting access to these sites?
Well, the trip we just went on, there were 2 places that we requested to be able to photograph and to come in on a tour, and once they kind of checked us out. They looked at our website. They confirmed that we had a grant to do this from a bona fide place, and they said, yeah, we could come and do the tour of the disposal site outside of Salt Lake City. So we had a chance to do that for almost a whole day, and we're able to photograph at will within the spaces that we were shown. And then the other place was really exciting. Because this project is about the movement of waste on highways, there's a small office that's about 1/10 of the space of this room, with maybe 3 laptops in it, and that's the office where all the waste that's channeling through all those interstate highways is being watched through via GPS on little laptops by a crew of 2 people who sit there. You know, they change crews, but those 2 folks are sitting there 24/7, watching that the trucks are moving as little dots on these highways in the way they're supposed to be, and that they don't go off where they're not supposed to be, or they haven't stopped someplace for too long. And that's the room we wanted to be able to photograph and interview the folks in there, because our project was so much about movement and these vectors of movement and change in the landscape, and how reality kind of bends around this material as it moves through the space it moves through. So we did get permission there. That took a lot of back and forth. They told us, we were able to do this for you, but you're probably the last ones. And it's because it took so many emails. So I think part of the work is also asserting, you know, our rights as citizens to see things that are not top secret. I mean, this place is not, there's websites about it on the internet.
We had to sign documentation that we wouldn't disclose the actual location of where we were. But it was just very strange, because the whole reason we knew where they were is because it's on the internet.
The phone number of how to contact them, and that's how we called and said, "Can we come and visit you?"
So it's all very strange. I mean, that felt a little. So yes.
We're actually making an art piece about that. There's a gallery in Brooklyn that's going to be displaying the email exchange, in which we say we agree not to disclose where this is, and then we're going to print out the website
where
next
they
to
disclose
it,
where it
and
is.
mount them next to each other.
Harper's Readings might be interested in that too.
Say what?
The readings section of Harper's Magazine.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's right.
Email.
That would be perfect.
And did you find out what happened if there was a spill of those trucks?
If
If there was a spill, would that be your...
Actually, that's very interesting. People who live along the routes, well, first of all the routes are watched over by officials like State Patrol, people like that. So they all know when the stuff is coming through. They're highly trained to take care of it if something happens. But also citizens volunteer to be trained in their neighborhoods if they live close to these routes. So you could, if you live close to one of these routes, you could volunteer to be a citizen who, if something happened, would spring into action, almost like, you know, the Red Cross or something, to offer whatever services that you feel you have to offer. And people undergo periodic training to keep those skills up along these routes.
Trucks are tracked by satellite also, so it's really, I mean, it really is high security. We had a chance to talk with one of the truck drivers while we were in Colorado. I mean, we passed these trucks maybe 4 times in our 10-day trip, and so when we were passing them, we were videotaping, we were, you know, hanging up cameras on them. So it's, I mean, I'm sure it was a very uneasy position for the driver to be wondering, like, what are you guys doing? So we had followed one of the truck drivers off of a exit ramp to a rest station and actually had a chance to talk with him, and he was stopping to call in the fact that he saw someone, you know, videotaping. So he was very friendly and actually allowed us to, he called in and let us take photographs. And it really kind of broke down that divide of thinking it's this thing to be really scared of. I mean, actually, you know, he's really doing his job. He's been driving these trucks for 10 years. It was this really kind of profound, transformative moment for us in terms of meeting the people who do this on a daily basis, that it's somebody's job. The same thing in the room where they're tracking the waste, being able to spend an hour with them photographing and hearing about what they do and seeing the environment they work in is also became a big change in terms of feeling like it's this overwhelming subject matter that it really is, you know, humans showing up. So we're doing it.
Have you checked back to see if they've changed their website?
No, it's kind of scattered all over. You know how websites kind of propagate. We saw it posted several places.
Which is definitely part of the motivation of these projects, is to like bring it into one place, because there's not one site you can go to learn about the different kinds of nuclear waste or the different kinds of storage, which we found kind of crazy making when we were doing the research. So 42 Cars really tried to make that more accessible to people in ways that we found were very challenging for us.
And we really see part of the work that we're doing is trying to address topics that really polarize audiences into pro, con, or for and against, and try to find new ways to talk about them so we can actually talk about them. Because when people are so polarized by something like nuclear waste or nuclear power, we aren't talking to each other. We're just spouting, you know, the habits of argument that have been given to us from somewhere else. So part of the project is really to experiment with coming up with contemporaneous ways of talking about these things.
I have a question, and I've been thinking about how to organize this, but it seems like you have a very neutral voice about these things, and I wondered if you're interested in making change, or you're leaving that up to all of us? You know, I don't feel like you're pushing an agenda, and I think there's an attempt to be somewhat neutral. Is that deliberate, or and how, you know, can you just talk about if you're seeking change, the venues for that with respect to, you know, where what we call art and where that lives typically or doesn't, or any of those? Big question, but
Yeah, no, it's a huge question. As human beings and citizens, we're not neutral. We both have real strong opinions, either shared or different from each other, about how politicians should deal with this stuff. But
right.
also as human beings, as a species, as members of this species, embodied in bodies that we're in, what's very real at this moment is that we are living in a planetary situation that is materially extremely different from what we evolved in as a species and from what we grew up in as civilizations or as cultures and democracies. The material conditions of life on this planet right now are changing so rapidly and massively in directions that are breaching the knowledges that we're bringing to bear on them. We really don't know how to handle a lot of the change that's happening right under our feet. So in terms of being change agents or seeking change, for us right now, the strategy is if we become contemporaneous with this moment, if we address this moment through ideas and information and knowledge and artworks that come from this moment, rather than bring textbook knowledge or political doctrines or dogmas from there and then to bear on the now, we think that the change agency is helping audiences and people who have aesthetic experiences in relation to this work, is helping them address these realities from this moment in terms of their material reality rather than these ideas or habitual ways of thinking of them that we bring to bear on them. If we just have knee-jerk reactions to these things. So it's almost like a reality-based, you know, like a reality-based approach seems to be a big impetus for change, because so much of how we talk politically about things like nuclear waste disposal is not reality-based in the sense that it's not really taking into account the material realities of the situation right now. It's really informed by Cold War discourses. It's informed by knee-jerk Republican or Democrat Party responses, and the material reality of these things, these materials, and the landscapes they create is far different from those ideas from the 40s, 50s, or 60s, or even 70s since 3 Mile Island. Fukushima, you know, threw it all up in the air again, literally and figuratively, in terms of what we don't know as engineers, as public policymakers, as citizens, and how we have to get contemporaneous with these things from here. So this feels like a little first step toward doing that as citizens who aren't scientists and as artists who are trying to create a way of being an artist that signals from the edge of the contemporary moment with aesthetic experiences and appeals to audiences, signals that edge of change and contemporary moment, which is what artists kind of do and have done in Western culture for a long time, is put themselves and their sensibilities at the edge of where we don't quite understand things with our words and with our books and with our sciences, but we maybe can understand them with our bodies or with our perception or with our hearing, understand them in different ways. And so we're trying to do that too, but we're trying to do it with these complex, wicked problems and these problems that can't easily be solved, that are changing and creating patterns that we don't recognize as humans yet.
feels like artists are some of the best prepared to do that, because we need creative people thinking of new ways to communicate these things and to communicate new ways of responding. But it's like the language is so heavy and latent. It's like we are trying to find new ways to even say the word nuclear, because the minute you say that, it's like people, tune out and can't think about it. But yet it's one of the most creative challenges we have. So we've really tried to, yes, neutralize the content in a way that makes it accessible, so that you don't immediately activate those set of responses. Otherwise, it stops before it even starts, which has been a huge challenge for us. I mean, we've had to invent these things to be able to even engage this material ourselves, because it is so heavy and overwhelming, and we're wondering if what we're doing can create the space for change to happen, or for people to think about these things differently, so that designers, architects, so these things can be talked about. But it's definitely an ongoing challenge. But that's a huge motivation, is to invent these new ways of thinking about these really complex things, so that change can happen, because the scales are so out of sync. I mean, we have a huge challenge ahead, and that's very real. So we definitely sense that. That's definitely at the core of the work. So it's designed as a typology, so you can actually read. There's 23 sites, and then there's these different typologies in terms of identifying the kinds of waste, the ways that they were generated, the type of landscape they create, so you can read across the cards. That was part of the design motivation, to make it more easy to read across the sites and interpret them in different ways, rather than just straightforward descriptions. Casco Bay, the last.
So, yeah. So as an introduction to the wonderful experience we had this week with students, do you want to say anything about this map first?
Yeah, it's just a Google map that was designed to sort of activate the routes of travel that we traveled with students under the name of Zuihitsu, which was the workshop we designed with art education, sculpture, photography students. So these were the 5 islands that we went with the mailboat, on the mailboat.
So if I could just conclude then by reading the provocation for this. The provocation for this project is this: that massive change in material realities of the planet we live on prompts some urgent questions, such as, what have we come to? What is the material reality of human life within this planet at this moment? What we thought we knew, that a national park, that hydroelectric dam, that power plant, that mountain range is this way or that way. These things we thought we knew must be researched again from new perspectives and for reasons that didn't even exist until very recently. So how might we meet up with the streaming places where we live and work? As researchers, how might we catch up with their new trajectories and where they've gotten to now? So that as artists and as designers, we might act in ways that actually address the real conditions and needs of contemporary life. Some practices of contemporary artists and artist researchers offer us some clues. We can innovate ways of seeing and perspectives of perception that are enmeshed, rather than exterior or from a distance or panoramic. One way to do this is to set ourselves and our points of view in motion with and within streaming landscapes. By moving within the Earth's material flows, we can accumulate lived sensations of how a human being figures in the streaming landscape. We can take up and make work and research through what Nicholas Bourriard has called the journey form. When Bourriard talks about the journey form, he's not talking about the journey of the hero, or he's not talking about the mythical quest. Instead, as being practiced by some contemporary artists, the journey becomes a deliberate act of passing through spaces and times with the intention of unlearning pre-given assumptions, habits of thought, and ways of seeing. By passing through and in tandem with a landscape's streams, we find ourselves having to negotiate reality, test and prod its obstacles, its counter-pressures, and its resistances. By exposing ourselves to a landscape's material surfaces and movements, we can make direct contact with the unexpected realities of contemporary landscapes. Doing this, we invite something of the chaotic outside, something not yet captured by official knowledge, to reassert itself through our bodies. We take up the role of artist as experimenter. Finally, taking a journey, we expose our bodies and minds to the energies held and released by the landscape. This is like taking a long exposure in photography. It allows minute impressions to accumulate. It coaxes into visibility events that occur beneath the thresholds of our ordinary perception. We move with the landscape as an event. We try to configure ourselves in ways that allow us to be and to last within it. This sets up conditions that invite us and even require us to invent concepts and actions that more and more adequately fit the real. We set ourselves in motion and orient ourselves in such a way, in such a state of mind and body, that we find ourselves inventing concepts that more and more adequately fit the real. Our goal then is to generate experimental concepts with dynamic images that help us catch up with the now of the planet's landscapes. Our goal, in other words, is to become contemporary with the landscapes we live within, so that we might begin to imagine and build ways of acting responsibly within them. And that's the project that we invited students to come with us on, a project inspired by those thoughts. So we had it out on the mailboat for 3 hours and invited them to move with the forces at play as they unfolded, and to make in the midst of that movement, and to see how the moving forces at play in Casco Bay inflected their practice. To see how the intentions that they brought, the habitual ways of doing things that they brought with them, ended up swerving in response to the material realities that they encountered, and hopefully ended up offering new perspectives, new ways of approaching their work that might not have happened if they hadn't put their bodies in that, in a configuration that invited those forces to concretely appear for them. And you'll get a chance to see their work displayed in the area gallery, because they're installing it now and over the weekend, I think, and it'll be up by Wednesday. So to see the experiments that they made while they're on the boat, please come by area gallery and check it out.
So we're happy to take further questions about any of the projects or our process. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.